I was listening to This American Life. I'm a little behind on my This American Lives, but I was catching up. I've been on a book tour, so I've fallen behind. And I just caught from about 3 weeks ago an episode of This American Life called Hot in My Backyard, which was about climate change. And a large part of this report takes place in Colorado. And reporter Julia Kumari Drapkin, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Julia, did a long report from Colorado where basically Colorado is on fire. In 2012, Colorado had a worst fire season ever. And now, of course, it's having an even worse fire season. Colorado is once again burning. And she was interviewing ranchers and farmers whose way of life is dying. Like, the world is burning around them. Their fields are dying, their crops are dying, their cattle is dying, their lifestyle is dying. And all of these people that she's talking to, they're in complete denial about climate change. You actually can't say climate change to them. They refuse to believe it, even as their world burns, even as their way of life collapses around them. And in the report, she really unpacks it. One of the reasons that people don't want to hear it, the state climatologist who features in Julia's report from Colorado can't even bring himself to say climate change to these folks, because he's afraid of being run out of his job. He's afraid of being fired, as other state climatologists have been fired in other conservative states for mentioning climate change being a reality. And this guy, the climatologist, he knows climate change is actually happening. He knows it's responsible for the new normal, which is dry and hot and on fire. That's the new normal in Colorado, but he can't say it because he will be murdered by these ranchers who are being really harmed by climate change. And he can't actually level with them and tell them the truth about what is going on in their own communities, what is actually happening to them, because they don't want to hear it. And they will murder anyone who tells it to them. They'll kill anybody who tells them the truth. There's this moment in Julia's report where she's run off of ranch by an angry rancher when he realizes that she is doing an environmental report. And listening to this show, oddly enough, reminded me of nothing so much. Listening to these people whose lives, whose lifestyles, whose livelihoods are being destroyed by climate change, who will not hear those two words, who refuse to believe the science. Listening to those people, it reminded me of nothing so much as standing around gay bars in Chicago, New York, in 1983, 1984, and listening to gay men who were in complete denial about the fact that AIDS was a sexually transmitted infection. They refused to believe it. They would cut your head off if you suggested that, because then that meant they were doing something wrong. That meant that there was something about the way we had been living that had brought about this biological catastrophe, and they wouldn't hear it. AIDS was a government plot. It was bad drugs. It was this. It was that. It was not a sexually transmitted infection. And there was aggressive pushback. Anybody who that early in the AIDS epidemic dared to suggest that it was an STI, those were fighting words. You'd be thrown out of a bar for saying that. And how ironic is that? That, you know, me as this gay guy listening to these ranchers and farmers and thinking, oh yeah, sounds like fags. Sounds like fags in 1983. You can't tell them the truth. They don't want to hear it. They're not ready to hear it. They're not ready to hear that the way we've been living is responsible for this catastrophe and that we're going to have to make changes. Those ranchers, those farmers, people in red states, people in their SUVs, they don't want to make changes. Those gay guys, 1983, 1984 in Chicago, New York, they didn't want to make changes either. They had to ultimately, because you can only live for so long in denial of science and reality. And eventually reality caught up with all those gay guys in the bars in Chicago and New York in 1983, 1984, 1982, who refused to believe that what was happening was actually fucking happening. And the science and reality is catching up with all of us who refuse to believe that what is actually happening is actually fucking happening, that we are changing the climate, that we are making this world uninhabitable. Gay men really kind of did make our world biologically uninhabitable for a while. And we had to make changes to save ourselves. We're going to have to do that again. And people are digging in the same way, the same foolish way that gay men did early in the AIDS epidemic. Folks in denial. And thinking about this just reminded me of this horrible thing. But folks forget, you know, in the AIDS walk, post-AIDS walks era and red ribbons and post-drug cocktails and HIV as a chronic manageable illness, the panic and the terror and the fear of those early years of the AIDS epidemic. And, you had people talking about quarantining people with, not just people with HIV or AIDS, but just gay people. You had conservative writers like William F. Buckley calling for all gay men to be tattooed on their buttocks so that people would know before they had sex. All HIV positive gay men to be tattooed on their buttocks. Which sounded a little Holocausty to us at the time, and people were dying, and that made it extra Holocausty. But what leapt to mind, the line that came back to me listening to that episode of This American Life was something Pat Buchanan wrote, really doing a victory dance in the end zone. He couldn't have been more delighted to see gay men dying. And he wrote, "Pity the poor homosexuals. They've declared war on nature, and nature is exacting its judgment." Listening to this show, listening to these conservative Republicans, their world burning around them, in denial of their complicity and responsibility, reminded me of that Pat Buchanan quote. We have declared war on nature, all of us, not just people living in red states, not just these ranchers, all of us. We have declared war on nature, and nature is exacting its judgment. The world's on fire. We're poisoning water tables, fracking. The honeybees are dying. We have declared war on nature, and it is exacting its judgment. And there is no escape. And there is only so long that you can live in denial before you have to face it and start making changes. The gay community went through this in 1983. We faced it and we made changes. It hasn't been perfect. There have been setbacks. HIV infection is still a problem in the gay community, but changes were made. Eventually we had to accept the reality that HIV was a sexually transmitted infection, and that ways in which we were behaving were making the epidemic incalculably worse. That we were harming ourselves and our communities and each other and destroying our world. We really were. We were destroying our world. We were fucking our world. Same too now with climate. We are destroying our world, and we're going to have to make changes sooner or later. Pity the poor humans. We have declared war on nature, and nature is exacting its judgment. Pat Buchanan, he wrote that, and I'm giving it back to you, you conservatives out there who are in denial about climate change. There you go. I'm going to throw that Pat Buchanan line in your face as it is suddenly relevant again.